So I'm going to open it up first. I'm going to say thanks to all the panelists. I have a bunch of questions written down. I've been scribbling madly, but does anyone have a burning question from the audience to begin? It feels like a lecture hall suddenly. So is everyone ready here? Okay, so I have a question for the panelists. I think it's really interesting to come together, a lot of notes around geographies, cultures, a lot of constants. I have two questions. So you can choose to, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to go, starting with Naveen, because you're still fresh, to tell me one of the two or both. The first one being, what's your moment of aha when you think about East Van history? Or what's a moment of concern when you think about, we kind of are celebrating East Vancouver history, but what are some of the dark, gritty, hidden secrets about East Van history that we don't talk about as much? So,
I live in Mount Pleasant on Fraser Street, and just outside of my house, they've put up these new banners on the street signs that talk about Mount Pleasant, and they have really Leave It to Beaver pictures of Fraser Street. So it's kids walking to school, it's milk trucks, and it's all that sort of stuff. And what it does is that it really, literally in a sense, whitewashes the history of Fraser and whitewashes the history of East Van. And this is one of my real pet peeves, is that Vancouver has always been intercultural, has always been multicultural, has always had this presence of other cultures there. And when we look back and not see it represented, it not only does a disservice to us here, but it does a disservice to those pioneers who have come. Not just South Asian, any pioneer who has come. Because that story of coming and of settling and of building society needs to be heard and needs to be recognized.
Seems a drag to go on another negative note, but...
or a moment of aha.
So I've lived in my house for 25 years, and before that I lived in a housing co-op for 10. But before that, over the 10 years before that, I lived in a lot of different places, and most of them have been torn down. So that's one of those things that just, it's such a drag to see what goes up when they take down the nice old houses. So hopefully we can get a little more active at keeping things. Also, I was researching my house the other day, and because I took a workshop recently on how to do it, and discovered that somebody who had lived in my house was the property manager at the Beacon Theatre. Oh. So that was kind of neat, but it's gone.
One of the things, I haven't researched it particularly, but I guess partly it comes from like watching shows like The Wire, and this type of thing, is our relationship with our port and the sea, and Vancouver being this type of gateway for goods, but also the relationship of the city to drugs over the years, everything from opium dens to a permissiveness around marijuana to gangland shootings to all of the innovative policies around harm reduction. Vancouver's been very innovative, and this relationship over the past century is quite fascinating, but I can't talk too much more about it because I haven't researched it yet.
Check. So I often do get those aha moments when, upon first searching for something online or wherever, you get no results, nothing. And it seems like this piece of history is gone. There's no trace or evidence of it. And then suddenly you come across a brochure just completely out of the blue, and there it is. It's like the picture, it's proof that, hey, this was here. And that's happened a lot recently with searching for murals. Often, like, the mural format is vulnerable to begin with. Like, they're usually exposed, they wear out, buildings change hands, they're not gonna last forever. But I have tracked down a few long-lost murals, in particular the Spencer's department store murals by John Innes. I was really hounding, and I got really close, and I found like some details. So those will be coming soon. I'll be posting those in the future. Yeah, that's that. I get those aha moments when I find, like, this is the piece that I've been missing.
I guess aha moments for me are also when I've had a photograph sitting on my desk, I guess for about 25 years. I hauled it out of the garbage can at City Hall where I used to work, and we used to clear out all sorts of stuff that should have never hit the garbage cans, and so I used to take it all home. And so it's photographs and negatives and fire insurance maps and all sorts of fun stuff. But there was this amazing looking building that looked, to my first glance, as sort of almost a Russian Orthodox church. And the name on the building was the Western Rubber Mat Limited, and so it had been repurposed. And I just had it sitting up there on the built shelf. I liked the building. And just searching and searching and always sort of thinking, I'm going to find this building one day. And looking at a fire insurance map, over at Franklin and Woodland, there on the fire insurance map was a notation, Buddhist temple. And I thought, Buddhist temple at Franklin and Woodland. What the heck is going on here? So I took the photograph out there, photographed the site. It's a U-Haul trailer rental site now. And so doing some more research, various things like that, looking in the background of photographs, one of the most valuable research tools for me. Thank you, Vancouver Archives, is putting up full resolution photographs online, which means you can delve deep into the background. And so I confirmed the existence of this thing in one of these photographs, and then started looking at the area. And lo and behold, this was Vancouver's second Chinatown. And so around Franklin and Commercial Drive and in there, starting in about 1909, a whole bunch of Chinese merchants started moving out there. And W.H. Chow, who was the only Chinese-Canadian registered architect, built a very fine rooming house and hotel out there, the Buddhist temple, a furniture company, and various other structures. And I'm thinking, okay, why is there a huge Chinese district out here? And then you go back into the books and council minutes and things like that, and you discover that City Council had a plan to expropriate all of Chinatown and move it to the east side of the city so that it wouldn't hamper the industrial and commercial development of the rest of the city. In anticipation of that expropriation, a bunch of merchants decided to get ahead of the city and hike it out to Franklin and Commercial Drive. And today when you're there, just the hotel survives. It's closed at the moment, but that's the only remnant of this once very busy Chinatown. And so that's an aha moment for me.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you, all the panelists. Well, John, you give me a perfect segue into my next question, is thinking about the geographies. East Van is a concept that a lot of us who live and work and kind of think about East Van in terms of Ken Lum's iconic sign, you know, the neon sign, the East Van Cross. It's both a geographic place, but also cultural identity. It's something that we take on as a marker. You know, you live and are a citizen of the Republic of East Van. But somehow, and this came up at the very beginning, I think somebody mentioned, why are we having it here? And here being the downtown east side or Chinatown. And John, you talk about Chinatown, but a lot of people don't. When you talk about East Van, you're not talking about the downtown east side or Chinatown. Can anyone from the panel illuminate some of their understanding of why this distinction has been maintained and is commonly held by a lot of people today? So I see John grabbing the mic.
Well, we could start quickly by the fact that the way names show up are quite simple. The West End and the East End, the old East End, which is today Strathcona, just come from the name of the schools. In 1891, they built the East End School and the West End School, and hence the neighborhoods. What's interesting about Strathcona is that's actually a very modern name, because as they were about to bulldoze the neighborhood for urban renewal in 1958, there's a council report that says, we are expropriating the first 15 blocks of the East End, comma, or shall we call it Strathcona after the school, end comma. And then they go on to tell you that they're expropriating because it's got the highest Chinese concentration of Chinese ownership, so they might as well get rid of those guys. But then they reinvent the place, not as the East End, but as Strathcona. And so it's wiping out an entire history and association of the East End. The downtown east side, I think, comes from that East End piece, and so is very distinct and separate from what I think people think of as the east side of the city, which has its own sort of world distinct from the west side of the city.
Em?
It's interesting, the name the Downtown East Side has been a very contested term because right up into the late 60s, the neighborhood in a very derogatory way was referred to as Skid Row or Skid Road, partially referring to the working class history, but as a derogatory term for places of underinvestment in urban centers. And through community organizing, Bruce Erickson, who helped found the Downtown East Side Residents Association, they began to use that term as an organizing tool because of the way the city portrayed the neighborhood. And so in rank and file, door-to-door organizing, they used that name as a way of reclaiming a place that they cared about. And they set the boundaries of it from Cambie all the way to Clark and from Pryor to the water. But in any city map, it was never ever recognized as a contiguous neighborhood. So it's something that was a political response to a situation. If you look at city maps today, they still separate out Downtown East Side, Oppenheimer District from Gastown and Chinatown and Strathcona as separate things. And oftentimes they're separated out in terms of planning processes as well. And I think it's a really important thing to know that it's only been 30 or 40 years that it's been a widely used term.
Thank you. So I have a question from the audience, but before I pose it to the panel, I'll remind everyone that if you're feeling shy and you don't feel like having somebody run up to you with a microphone and asking the question yourself, then feel free to tweet it. We have some organizers tonight watching the Twitter wall up here, so just make sure that you indicate that it's a question that you'd like passed up to the front and we'll ask it on your behalf. But we have a question from Dan, who'd like to know what stories about East Van's past can help us make, and I'm going to add, good decisions about policy and culture. This is something that I think is really embedded in East Van's DNA, is culture and kind of, whether it's militant or just very transformative change, East Van is really the home of a lot of this kind of dynamism. So what are some standout kind of historical moments that we can look to and learn from? I'm looking at you, Jill. Maybe some specific examples, or John, or... Yeah.
Well, I guess, when I was putting together my thoughts about the activism and what's still around and what isn't, and knew I only had 5 minutes, so I had to limit myself. But I kept thinking about it, and I started thinking of other things that started out just as real grassroots endeavors. And I don't know specifically if it started on the East Side, but I'm sure there were a lot of East Siders who were part of it, and that's Mountain Equipment Co-op. It started as just a group of people who wanted to get some good outdoor equipment, and they would get together, kind of like the Pre-Order Food Co-op, from what I hear, decide what equipment they needed and figure out where to get it. And I think initially they would put in joint orders to REI, the big co-op in the States, and get it up. So I guess what I get out of that is that it's worthwhile starting something small. Like some people go, oh, that's, you can't do very much, just the few of you, but you actually can.
Yeah.
I was going to add that, when SFU was moving here, there was a lot of concern from neighborhood residents, and rightfully so, around the role of art and culture in gentrification. But one of the things to note is that the artist-run centers that emerged out of here that are literally within 5 or 6 blocks of here, the Ore Gallery, Art Speak, Western Front in Mount Pleasant, Vivo. Many of these organizations started out as people in people's apartment buildings and rooms, and only slowly began to be able to acquire space. And many of them were gentrified out of neighborhoods themselves. But for many of the people who are known as well-known artists in Vancouver that had illustrious international careers, people like Ken Lum, Jeff Wall, Stan Douglas, many of their first shows were in these small artist-run centers that have an international reputation. And now, as these institutions have 30 or 40-year histories, some of the younger artists who are coming out of school are finding it difficult to get their first shows because many of these places are part of that world art market. And so what we're seeing is places around Mount Pleasant and Strathcona where people are starting galleries out of their own houses, and we're seeing pop-up galleries. And it's the same type of ethos that was in the 70s and 80s that these places began in the first place.
I just have a quick point about that, and I think it relates to two stories. Just across the street, there's a building around the corner by Victory Square, and it was a meeting place back in 1914 where the South Asian community met to raise funds for the Kamagata Maru. And they raised, having been paid a discriminatory wage because they were South Asian, $50,000 in one night when you're being paid, several dollars a day. And the next day, there was a meeting by the white supremacist organization of Vancouver, quote unquote, and they raised a whole bunch of money as well too. And the other story I want to tell is of the Canadian Farm Workers Union. And when the Canadian Farm Workers Union was starting up, they held meetings in farmlands where migrant workers were working, but they also held meetings at community centers in East Vancouver. And they would use dance and art as a tool to bring these people in and use the songs and the lyrics of those songs as tools to people to value their labor and to join the union. So in a sense, going back to this long tradition of activism, it has genealogies that stretch back to the 70s, stretch back to the 50s, and link in with other community groups that were strong at that time period too.
I just was thinking about things too, and one of the things that I found quite a lot of interesting for me is that I have the pleasure of sitting on the board of the Vancouver Moving Theatre Company, and we hold our meetings in the basement of the Ukrainian Hall over at Pender and Hawkes. And so sometimes we're lucky and they're dancing upstairs, we get to listen to the music, and sometimes it's pierogi lunch, and so we benefit for that. But one of the days that we were there, I was talking to one of the women who helped run the place, and she was talking about photographs and what to do about photographs. And I sort of said, well, what? And she says, well, I'm organizing the archives, and I need to know what to do with the photographs. And so I went upstairs, and in this tiny little room was just books and books and books and books and books and books of photographs. And when you start looking at them, it is the entire history of the progressive movement in Vancouver. These guys were the ones that made sandwiches for the guys that were trying to jump the trains to go to Ottawa. These were the guys that were bandaging the heads that got broken when Mayor McGeer let the mounted squad out with the dock workers in 1935. Those lunches going up into the Carnegie Museum, packed by the ladies at the Ukrainian Hall. And what was really interesting is they helped start the Peace March. They helped start all sorts of stuff. And it's a group now of relatively old ladies at the Ukrainian Hall who are still just as fiery and still just as determined. And they're over there at Hawkes and Pender. And so we come by our sort of activism in the East Side naturally.
And those pierogies are really good. I highly recommend it to everyone. We have another question from the audience. I think if you've asked a question, Ajay is going to put up your hand and Ajay will come and run up your prize. So. So Irv Lau, he comments and asks, I've spent my childhood in Chinatown. It's hardly the same now. In 5 to 10 years, do you think Chinatown will be a Chinatown in name only?
Sorry. I spend so much time in Chinatown, it isn't funny, because it's kind of my backyard. I don't think it'll just be in name only. Chinatown, our Chinatown, Victoria's Chinatown, and others are very resilient places. And our Chinatown is interesting because of its physical nature. I mean, you're never going to erase the physical structure, but there's enough deep-seated culture in Chinatown that it will survive. It's going to definitely change, and as any neighborhood changes or evolves, change happens. And I think part of the problem we have with a place like Chinatown is that when it was declared a historic district in 1971 along with Gastown, the first thing the city did was go out and beautify it. And so they removed the telephone poles and they paved the streets with concrete stamped to look like villages in the new territories in Hong Kong. They had a contest to design lights for Chinatown. What do? Design dragon lights. One of the problems for Chinatown is there are too many dragons in Chinatown. No, seriously. And the dragons are also pointing the wrong way, so they're actually bringing bad luck to the area. You've got to know your culture. And then they planted ginkgo trees. And if you've ever been down there, right about now, there's one spot in the 100 block which just smells like nothing else. That's because they planted the wrong type of ginkgo trees. Everyone else, all the other trees are great. 3 trees are the wrong type, so they smell. Ginkgo trees do that. And one of the interesting things about the beautification program, the first design of it was rejected by the city because it wasn't, quote, Chinese enough. And so we're trying to impose our view of what Chinatown is on top of Chinatown. And so when we had the debate, mainly on the radio program on CBC about the skateboard shop that opened up, everyone was, it's 2 Caucasian guys, they opened a skateboard shop. I wonder what the reaction would have been if it was 2 Chinese guys that opened the skateboard shop. Right, so Chinatown will survive. It will be very different, but it will be Chinatown, and it will not lose the soul of what the place is.
Yeah. If I may, there was this great exhibition, you were a part of that Center A, that spoke about the history of Chinatown. I think the question that arises is, how do we define this Chinatown? What Chinatown are we trying to retain? Are we trying to Asianify or Orientalize a Chinatown? That exhibition at Center A that Anne was a part of on the BC Electrical service, it spoke about Chinatown being this vibrant space, having this independent vaudeville tradition, contrary to Gastown, where there would be African-American artists who'd come to Chinatown and Vancouver and sort of test out their shows before going down to Seattle and San Fran and LA. And Anne, maybe you can speak more about it, but it speaks to this really interesting history of what Chinatown is. Chinatown is a lived space. It's not an imagined space. Well, actually, it's both. It's an imagined space, but it actually is a place where people live and engage with. And that's the interesting Chinatown we should retain.
Yeah, I've actually had a chance to live in a social housing building that's predominantly for Chinese seniors, but they had some market rate rental units. It's the building right in front of the Chinatown gate. Lived there for a couple of years and was just a fantastic opportunity to share cultures and spend time with people. And I used to work in Jenny Kwan's office, so was on the campaign trail with her many times in many of the newer social housing projects that were built in the 90s and a little bit after. So the population in and around Chinatown within a few blocks is actually quite substantial with seniors, and I think that there's enough of a richness in the history that it's going to continue on.
I have to say, though, it certainly is different than it used to be. I hadn't been there in quite a while and walked through recently and was kind of shocked at it. When I first lived in Vancouver in 1970, I spent a lot of time in Chinatown. I would go to Wo Fat for the fabulous great big cookies that they had. The doors, the restaurants, the green door and the orange door. It was a fabulous place to hang out, and it's so different now. I'm glad to hear that it's not going to disappear, because I was wondering when I was walking through there.
Jason?
Just a couple of little Chinatown anecdotes that I was quite proud of uncovering. Those murals for the 1939 Golden Gate Expo were painted in a warehouse / building off of an alley in Chinatown. I'm not sure if it's Shanghai Alley, but there's a good chance that it was. And those murals were huge. They're like 15 feet by 10 feet. They would have been, had to ship them down by train, I'm sure. And I also learned one of the artists that I featured had his studio above the Sam Key, the Narrow building. And he had a studio there in the 70s, and he's still around, and I got to meet him and interviewed him. So these connections you can still make, and they'll take you back, not just like a decade, but you can go back generations if you talk to the right people. So get out there and start asking questions.
So I think we're coming to the end, but I think, just to cast our eye forward, I think the things we're hearing are themes that, Chinatowns or histories don't disappear. They just layer, and you have to zoom in sometimes in order to see the bigger picture. You have to understand the texture of it and look for it in unlikely places. And it comes in all different forms: archives, illustrations, art, personal archives. And so I think taking this question about Chinatown, though, and mapping it back onto the notion of East Van, for me, East Van has this interesting thing. Chinatown is based on an ethnocultural and geographic, very discrete, very defined set of identities and parameters. But what does the future of East Van, like at this point in East Vancouver's history, if we can if we're to pause and reflect on this moment in East Vancouver's evolution, is East Vancouver going to be this important construct or concept in 10 or 15 years when the real estate market and geographic understanding of Vancouver has actually expanded to become Metro Vancouver? Is East Van still going to be cool? Will East Van still have the brand cachet that it has now, or will all the cool kids and cultural and activist hub have migrated even further east to New West or Surrey?
I think there's a lot of Burnaby that we can appropriate.
Okay.
Well, East Vancouver, I think, was originally a creation of the West Side. Now, that's not based on any historical analysis or anything, but you'd hear them say, well, this event happened in East Vancouver, and East Vancouver is this huge area. And then you think, well, yes, but it happened, over here in Cedar Cottage. Or, like people from East Vancouver know that it's made up of little pieces. People on the West just see one amorphous area. And so I think that will still be the same, even though the houses cost way too much. They're still cheaper than on the West Side, so I think it will maintain some of that. And I really enjoy the East Van marker, where it's like taking control of that story, not letting it just be put on you by the people on the other side of town.
If nobody else has a burning reply, do you have Okay, Em, go ahead.
No,
I was going to pick on you guys.
I was just going to say, it wasn't that long ago in the city of Vancouver, right up until the mid-'60s, you had to own property in order to vote. And Bob Williams, who went to Britannia High School, was a city councillor in his mid-30s, and they fought to change that. And I think one of the challenges about maintaining East Vancouver, which is heavily gentrifying through its many neighborhoods, is that land use policy gets decided by city council under our system. And for too long, we've had a total free market system where we've had no election spending limits. There's no limits on how much developers or other interest groups can donate to political parties in the same way that we have for provincial or federal levels. And until we get big money out of civic politics, I think it's going to be very difficult to maintain a kind of affordability or have an agenda around that that's going to save what it is that we're looking to save in terms of why East Vancouver matters to us.
I wanted to turn it to, before everyone claps, this seems like a good opportunity to pick on the Drive producers. I think I loved your promo trailer despite the technical malfunctions. And I think it resonates with a lot of us here, but at the same time, what was the particular inspiration or motivation for capturing this particular kind of zeitgeist of the Drive, and why the Drive versus, I don't know, Point Grey?
Well, that's... Oh, right. Is it... Hello? Yeah. Actually, Point Grey is our next web series. No. Well, to be honest, I've lived there for about 10 years now. And a lot of the producers have either lived there as well and had a really strong connection to it, so it starts there. And then it just goes from us really the love for our neighborhood, and on top of that, like you mentioned, the zeitgeist in terms of just noticing what's going on with our friends around us. and really wanting to tell that story through the lens of our experience in the Commercial Drive neighborhood. It's just an amazing neighborhood, incredibly diverse and nurturing. And actually just being here, and I've learned so much from this panel, and this is such a fantastic
So
event.
do they each get a guest spot in your season if it gets picked up?
One of the things that's come up quite a bit, and please cut me off if I'm rambling, because that tends to happen, is that I think one of the amazing things about the Commercial Drive neighborhood is that it has this capacity to really evolve, and it has this immense diversity, and there's all this fear of gentrification and all these things that are affecting it and part of its growth. But it has this incredible grace that it shows in its evolution, and I'm not saying it's some wildly perfect utopia. It has its problems, but it sort of has this capacity to hold with such grace all these different ethnic diversity, socioeconomic backgrounds, and it has the capacity to nurture. And that's been my observation from living there. And that's sort of something that I find very unique to Vancouver and wish that I had seen more of that. So we just wanted to tell our experience in a neighborhood that we love so much, and to involve the neighborhood. It's almost like a paying homage or a thank you as well, because it's been such a part of our personal growth and the growth of our friends. So really, that's a really long-winded answer to your question. Yeah. Oh, good question, Dan Manigan. I find out more information about this web series on the driveseries.com, everybody. Driveseries.com.
That's thedriveseries.com. Thank you. So I have a couple, now that people are more relaxed and we're coming to the end, I'm told we have an extra 10 minutes. So again, do we have any questions that you'd like to, okay, here we go. See, people are more relaxed now. So we've got 2 questions up here. You can ask them directly to the panelists yourself.
Just say your name first. Hey there, I'm Nick. Thanks for doing this, guys. I really appreciate it. I get a gift. Nice. So there's an era in Vancouver history that most people would probably agree is a bit of a dark era. The kind of thing where we want to run a freeway through Chinatown, that kind of thing. We're going through a bit of an era of gentrification and stuff now. Do you think we're going to look back on this era and regret it? I'm talking like International Village, Woodwards, and that type of development. I can expound.
Oh, great question.
Good, you had me worried.
Speaking personally, it's hard to equate the two, because the way the city used to be run was one guy, Gerald Sutton Brown. He was called the Board of Commissioners, though there was just one. And one famous letter or memo from a couple of mayors that served under Sutton Brown, it was Aylesbury, wrote a memo to Sutton Brown that said his technical reports about infrastructure improvements and various other programs were too complicated and unnecessarily detailed for council. So if he could just simplify it, council would appreciate that. And what Aylesbury really did was hand Sutton Brown the keys to the cupboard and just say, go for it. And Sutton Brown ran the place, and he did whatever he felt like. And so you got those really awful decisions like urban renewal, which was targeted at the ethnic communities, because the South Asian neighborhood around Burrard Street and 2nd Avenue was wiped out for a connector road for the proposed freeway. Chinatown and the Strathcona neighborhood were targeted because of its Chinese population. I don't think we could ever get to that stage today, but I think we have to be mindful, because much of what gives Vancouver, love or not, its quality of life is the activism that rose up because of those things. And then that council that came in, Art Phillips, who just passed away, if you read his inaugural speech, it's an extraordinary piece of work, because he envisions the city which we actually have today. I think we have to be mindful, though, and that you have to continually keep council and people on their toes and always fight for stuff. And so I think the Woodwards thing is actually an amazing piece of work that came out of a lot of hard slog and everything else. And I think there are other really great projects, but we can also get sort of enamored with ourselves and think that everything we do is great, and that's when the danger sets in. So I think we always have to be aware. But I don't think this project or International Village is the thin edge of a wedge.
Any other responses? Okay. We had a second question from the same corner.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for all your interesting viewpoints and information about different kinds of research. You can just see how many different directions and fascinating directions, from geographical to intercultural. I've always been interested in how cultural relationships between people, and so frequently, I used to work for many years at the Vancouver Archives, and I was always hunting for little things that were I was curious about, and one of the things was Chinese relationships with white people, or Indian people, Native Indian people, or Eastern Indian people, South Asian, but it was always with the so-called dominant culture. And I was always curious about finding out more what the relationship was between South Asians and Chinese people, or Chinese people and Native people. And so I'm just, Naveen, I'm fascinated with your research, and I was curious about where you got some of your images. That's one thing.
I stole them.
And curious also, you know, as a English-speaking researcher, curious about this, to somehow collaborate with people who would be able to read or communicate with people from South Asian community and Chinese community and Native community too. And you know, I'm just curious to hear your opinion or ideas about how to go about doing that, or maybe even what might be a crucial issue around which to begin that kind of research.
No, it's a great question, and I think many people on the panel will have a great answer for you. I'll just start the ball rolling by saying that there's a very strong tradition of intermarriage between Chinese Canadian and First Nations people in Vancouver that goes back to the early times, over a century. And Henry Yu, actually, at UBC, tracks that history and has some great articles about that. In the South Asian community, it's interesting because there's a word that's used for First Nations people, which isn't used, I don't think, in places like Winnipeg, Ajay, or other places around Vancouver, or around Canada, sorry. And it's a Punjabi word for being on your taike, mother's side of the family, your mother's uncle? Nanke. Well, it's the other side. So it's like this. Yeah, it's like this idea that Indians are a part of the family. So they aren't called Indians in Punjabi. They're called taike. They're called my father's side of the family. There's an interesting sort of connection that goes on there, and it links to the histories of East Van, the histories of Second Avenue, Gurdwara, and the cultures that were there. One more last point, and I think Hannah might go back to your aha moment, but there was this really interesting archive that we found in the attic of this person who lived in White Rock, and his family used to be secretaries at that old temple. And the first Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, came to Vancouver in 1949, and we found in this dude's attic, we found a record of his speech, and it was 3 records, double-sided, and he's speaking in Urdu and in English about South Asians living in Canada, and how South Asians living in Canada should take an active role in Canadian life because there's no difference between the values of India and Canada. And because it's 49, he also talks about partition and the assassination of Gandhiji and everything else. But the coolest thing is that Nehru says that I wanted to come to Vancouver because I know about the histories of the South Asians here and the struggles that they've gone through. So I was asked to come to Ottawa. I had to go to Ottawa, he says. And I wanted to go to Toronto, and I wanted to go to Montreal, but I said, forget it, I have a limited amount of time, I'll come to Vancouver. And so there's these great pictures of military parades for Nehru, which is ironic considering his nonviolent past, but there's military parades for Nehru and City Hall stuff and all those sort of things. But again, it's in these people's attics, literally, that you have to find it. And I was so excited, I reported my dad's record player, and then I digitized it on my iPhone, and then it's up on the website now. So yeah.
Just one real quick thing to mention is the Chinese-Canadian Historical Society of BC has a fabulous book called Cedar and Bamboo, and it is about First Nations and Chinese cooperation, marriage, and all those stories around that sort of thing. It's quite a fabulous little publication. It's still in print, and it's going to get reprinted shortly with a new cover and things. And then I've been doing some work, personal research around Marpole, and I've always known there were Chinese market farms down in Marpole area, but what was interesting was the Musqueam leased very early on a whole bunch of land to Chinese market gardeners, and so it was a cooperative venture between those two groups, and so you see a lot of that intercooperation in this area.
There's a really great documentary about cedar and bamboo as well.
Yes, that's right.
So I encourage everyone to watch it. But so anyone have any last burning questions? Because I think we're being invited to wrap up here. So, oh.
If you did Sonia. Oh, I saw Sonia. Sorry, I should have picked on you. Is it okay? You can pick on them afterwards. They're going to be around. Just say your name.
Hi guys, I'm Sonia. My question is, a lot of the people coming together to create community events are around downtown, so West Hastings-ish. So I'm just wondering if you have any ideas or any kind of things you're seeing happening further east on Hastings Street, because there's not a lot of community centers there. The neighborhoods are a little bit disparate from each other. So there are new businesses popping up, but is there anything we can do to kind of propel things forward at a faster pace?
Hold a meetup in your nearest coffee shop. Just throw out some ideas. I belong to a few meetups, but the movie meetup meets at the Fontana Cafe, almost at the border of Burnaby. But no, you could start up like a local history or a local interest meetup and just see who comes in your neighborhood. That's one possibility.
Can I rephrase it as to multitask here and get some closing thoughts by asking each of the panelists to, again, looking ahead. So we have maybe a tweetable summary of not looking back, but if we want to be inspired about East Vancouver's future by learning, making connections to all the heritage and history that we learned about today. So where on the map of East Vancouver and what? So what would you like to see happen? What's something that you want to plant a seed for in this crowd, and where specifically on this East Vancouver map that we all kind of have forming in our minds right now? So more meetups in the Hastings Sunrise block. I don't know, more food co-ops.
Yeah. Hashtag. Fear the hipster.
Fear the hipster. Okay,
and in that sense, this hipster is this, not just the facade of someone who wears certain clothes as the guy wearing the red pants, but this idea of not being engaged in the communities and the histories of the place you go into. Whether it's Maine and whether it's the people from Maine being pushed to Fraser and ostracizing the Vietnamese histories or the South Indian histories that are there or whatever. It's you can wear the clothes, but please understand the histories of where you've come from so that there's an engagement there with this history of Vancouver where you go. So hashtag. So
East Van isn't a brand, and you want
East
this
Van isn't
everywhere.
a brand. Yeah,
it's not
exactly.
just a brand.
Exactly.
Or a moving company with a black truck.
or a sign or a plaque or a
I
museum.
know, but it's very branded now.
Yeah, it's not a museum either. It has to
Right.
grow,
Okay.
but grow in a real way.
I'll add one more thing too. Walking tours, amazing. Like host a walking tour in your neighborhood. Give
Jane's
your
Walk coming
perspective
up.
of your neighborhood. And like I've learned so much from taking immense number of John's walking tours, and I take them whenever I can. So.
You can also put in those little libraries, like the little library that's at the corner of Lakewood and is it Kitchener, Charles, is in the summertime when it's warm, and there's always people standing there talking. It's fabulous.
Some more libraries.
Here's a hot tip. A great guy named Mauro Vocera has just become the executive director of the Italian Cultural Center. It's got a place with cheap beer. It has indoor bocce ball. And they have a huge amount of parking lot space where they're looking to build some social housing. But one of the observations that Mauro made is that these communities came to Vancouver in different periods. You know, the Italians built their cultural center. There was a Croatian cultural center that was built, but many more recent diaspora communities, like in the 90s, the Serbian community, many other communities that came here to be able to purchase land, to put up their own community center is financially very difficult. That some of these older centers that are quite large in size can actually become a welcoming space for these new diaspora communities. But I think there's an opportunity to do arts and culture and repurpose some of these spaces and to use them in a more interesting way.
And it's right by the SkyTrain.
I just thought of another one. We've had some really windy weather lately. Let's have some kite flying festivals. You know, it's a free country. We can fly a kite here.
All right. Somebody tweet that.
I guess it's just to reiterate, just to get to know the place you actually live in. I'm surprised at how many times I meet people when I set a walking tour, say at 27th and Fraser, and because the whole area out there is totally fascinating, but I'm standing there and people show up and then somebody will come by and says, "Is this the walking tour?" "Yeah." "Okay, I got to ask you before I join, why?" And you go, "Because 27th and Fraser, this is a cool neighborhood." "Really? Just come with us and go." And at the end of the tour, their eyes are wide open because they've seen things. They've looked at houses, they've looked at trees, whatever. They've seen a whole thing. They've driven down Fraser Street a million of times, just never turned off and looked. And no matter where you live, it is interesting. And my favorite, and I'll leave it at this, but this favorite anecdote, many, many, many years ago, somebody came up to me and said, "Gee, I wish my neighborhood was interesting." And I said, "Well, your neighborhood's interesting." "No, it isn't." And I said, "Well, we'll do a walking tour next Saturday in your neighborhood." "You can't." I said, "Why?" "It's not interesting." And I said, "Well, where?" So I said, "Where do you live?" And she said, 24th and Nanaimo. I was like, "Oh my God, that's so cool. That is a great neighborhood." And she goes, "It's nothing but Vancouver specials." And I said, "That's what makes it so cool." So get out there, know your neighborhood, and just live where you live.
Well, thanks. My eyes are wide open and I'm energized. Lots of kind of new thoughts seeded tonight. So I think everyone should learn, connect, share all the things that you guys learned today. There's a lot of really great gems. So thank you, and thanks to AJ, and I'm going to turn it back to you now.
Thank you.